What's going on, everybody? Thank you all so much for tuning in to another episode of Mika Says Sukasa. As usual, I am your host, Niko House, and I feel like it's been a couple of days. It has been. Y'all have to forgive me. I know I usually do my podcast every day, but this last week or so, I have been slipping. The reason why, just for your information, is because, we've been preparing. If you don't know, which I think most of you would, if you follow my YouTube channel, if you follow my Facebook or my Twitter, you know I'm in the process of starting up a multi-channel broadcasting network. So obviously there's a lot of moving parts involved. I'm literally working on my website every day, trying to get it updated so we can go ahead and do the soft launch. I'm coordinating with like 10 people, which in itself, by the way, in and of itself is another task. We're making some big additions to the channel. As you can see, also, if you've been to the channel, we've got the logo update. I mean, we got a lot done in a very short amount of time. But because of that, it's been very hard to keep up with, with doing the podcast every single day. But once, I would say probably by the end of this week, we'll be done. And so we'll actually not done, obviously, but by the end of the week, we'll be done with getting everything in order so that we can go ahead and go back to our daily podcast and even uploading more onto YouTube. Because right now I've only been able to do about 1 or 2 videos a day. But once everything is all said and done, I'll be able to go back to posting about 3 to 4 or possibly 5, depending on what's going on in that day, and still doing our daily podcast. So thank you all for being so patient. I know a lot of people have been saying, hey man, what's going on? Where's your podcast? And I know I've posted a few in the last couple of days, but I know I haven't been posting them every single day as usual. And so, like I said, on next week, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled program, if you will. So, thanks once again to our Patreon followers. Make sure you go to support the show at www.patreon.com/MikaSaysSukasa. You've all been a tremendous help with helping us grow the show, grow the network, grow the channel. I mean, anybody who's been with us from the beginning knows all we had was a cell phone and headphones, some iPhone headphones. And so we've clearly grown substantially since then. And if anybody's been watching the production of my YouTube channel now compared to what it was, when we first started in 2016, then they'll even be able to tell you, like, yeah, the money's going to the right resources, and it's helping us grow and promote the channel, and it's helping us with marketing and everything. I mean, you all have been absolutely amazing with traveling, being able to cover. Last week, I actually covered an event for Stephanie Myers in Florida. Okay, and she was actually the person who helped assemble the other quote-unquote Women's March last year, because she didn't feel like the Women's March substantively addressed anything, which obviously, if you remember my opinion on this, I felt the same way. And so she had an event that garnered 22,000 people, and so she had another event called Wonder Woman Rise this year, and I was able to make it out to that to speak at that event. So, and once again, like I said, that those type of things do cost money. And so whenever I have a substantive Patreon following, it makes it easier for me to make those types of moves in the political world, where I can speak and also give coverage. I'm writing an article about that. And we can always improve our outreach and help grow awareness when we have a solid Patreon following. So as always, I don't care how much people get tired of me saying it, I owe this show, this channel, to my patrons, and I never want them to forget that or think I am unappreciative of that. So with that being said, what we are going to cover today is the question that seems like it's going to be posed in 2020, which is Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders. Now, before I start this podcast, let me say, this podcast is not to attack either Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. This podcast isn't to say which one is better, which one is worse. This particular show is about a legitimate analysis of their rhetoric, their policies, their policy advocation, and their past, so that we know going into 2020 what we are going to need to combat, what we are going to need to discuss, and God forbid, what we're going to do if Tulsi decides to run and Bernie Sanders decides to run at the same time in the Democratic primary election. Which, by the way, there are some benefits to that, but because this is not going to be like all, hunky dory, rainbows and sunflowers, okay? Because they both, especially as of late, have had with Bernie Sanders specifically, but as of late, Bernie has had some problematic rhetoric. In the past, Tulsi has had some problematic rhetoric, and that's going to be addressed come 2020. And I think that we should discuss it so that we can know how to approach it better if that conversation were to arise. Because I think one of the beautiful things about the Bernie Sanders was that whenever Hillary Clinton or her trolls or the establishment tried to attack Bernie Sanders, we had immediate responses that made it very easy to deter any of the lies or the misdirection or the misrepresentation of any of Bernie Sanders' votes. Like whenever Hillary Clinton tried to blame Bernie Sanders and say that Sandy Hook was his fault because he voted against some gun legislation, or at least legislation that pretended that it was going to actually do some legitimate gun reform, and that actually wasn't that legislation's intention. It was half-assed gun reform. He felt like we didn't hold the manufacturers accountable in that legislation. And on top of that, it had earmarks with that legislation as well. And so Bernie Sanders said this doesn't go far enough. And then Hillary Clinton tried to flip that and say, oh, that means that you directly contributed to the Sandy Hook incident, which is weird because to me, just as an aside, if that happened like now, for example, like God forbid, I really hate invoking this guy's name, but if Alex Jones said that, as you all know, he just had his channel removed temporarily. He got put back, but Tim Black lost his streaming privileges for 60 days. He's in the appeals process. Jason Goodman lost his channel for a couple of months. He finished his appeals process and got it back, or he lost his streaming privileges. Jamarl Thomas lost his streaming privileges, and they didn't say anything. None of them said anything that was just egregiously wrong or a lie. However, Hillary Clinton can stand on the debate stage and say that Bernie Sanders was a direct cause of Sandy Hook, and nobody really bats an eye about it. So that's why it's important for us to have these discussions, because if we're going to move forward and educate the masses and be able to counteract any of the bullshit that is being put out by neoliberals, establishment Republicans, establishment Democrats, establishment people in general, elitists, corporatists, which we know in 2018 and 2020, they are coming in full effect. We already have a candidate in Texas, which, by the way, go vote if you have not yet, in the Texas Senate election, the Texas Democratic primary election for the Senate. Sema Hernandez is running against Congressman Beto, B-E-T-O. He is pretending to be a progressive. He is not. He is not a progressive. He's taken hundreds of thousands of in PAC money. He's taken hundreds of thousands in like corporatist donations. He is not for the things that you are for. So go vote for Sema Hernandez so that she can go and smack Tom Cruise in that general election. But that's the example I'm speaking of. They have taken one of the problems that, and this is what I'm segueing into one of the problems with Bernie Sanders. With Bernie Sanders, as much as I love him, right? He's naive at times, in my humble opinion. Now, he is a chess player. He is a 3D chess player. In fact, he's so good of a 3D chess player that he's been able to be in this U.S. Senate and the U.S. House as an independent and get legislation passed with both parties in all types of in all types of administrations, whether it be with the Clinton administration, whether it be with the Bush administration or the Obama administration, whether the Republicans had dominance over the House and the Senate, or whether the Democrats did, he was still able to get legislation passed. So that's great. However, he is still naive. So when he created this unity committee, it created the air or the idea that, oh, well, maybe we're actually breaking through into the Democratic establishment. But the Unity Committee, which features the people like Nomiki Kantz, has not actually been able to break through anything. In fact, it's arguable at this point that the Unity Commission has lost more people, or lost power, that the progressives have lost power because of two reasons. One, look at what happened with the Rules and Bylaws Committee. They took off progressives, one, and then two, they put more neoliberals on, including one named Donna Brazile. And this is while the Unity Commission was in place. So clearly they're not making as much ground as they would like, but it's even worse because now they know exactly what we want. They know what Bernie Sanders is advocating for, because Bernie Sanders is guiding his Unity Committee, trying to get them to change rules, trying to get them to promote a platform that's his. And look at what's happening because of that. You have the likes of Kamala Harris pretending that she wants single payer health care, that she wants that she's pro-environment, that she's not in the pockets of the prison industrial complex, that she's not in the profits of the big banks, that she's not in the pockets of the establishment. And we know she is. If you don't know who Kamala Harris is before she became a U.S. Senator, there's a reason. Because Kamala Harris was a disingenuous prick. She helped Murdoch while she was Attorney General. She helped bail him out. She was bailing banks out in California and protecting them. She was facilitating the prison industrial complex, trying to enforce mandatory minimums. I mean, the history of Kamala Harris is so extensive, and yet you've never heard of her until she became a senator. And all of a sudden she's a rising star in the Democratic Party because she said some stuff that she said some stuff about Donald Trump, and then she went and took Bernie Sanders' platform. So now these Democrats, remember when they did the same thing to Al Gore? Al Gore converted to establishment. Remember they did the same thing to Howard Dean? Howard Dean became a victim of the establishment and even became establishment himself as they gave him power in that party. Now, in 2010, Joy Ann Reid even said Bernie Sanders will be the voice that the Democratic Party needs, and they will ignore him just like they ignored Howard Dean. Joy Ann Reid said this. And they will ignore him, and they did ignore him until the point where it was detrimental. But now they've completely co-opted all of his policies. And so when you combine the fact that they co-opted all of his policies and he's been perpetuating some very dangerous rhetoric and logic when it comes to how we deal with things overseas, whether it be with Russia or actually just pretty much Russia and then Syria as well. And the fact that he has this account that's under his name that's verified, but it says that all the tweets are coming from staff. But at the same time, that's still representative of his brand. I am 100% behind the idea that he is not in control of that particular Twitter account. In fact, I would even venture to say that there's a high probability that because that Twitter account, which is that Twitter account, the Bernie Sanders account, was created when he was running for president, and he promoted on that channel or that Twitter account. He fundraised. He used that Twitter account to fundraise. He used that Twitter account to spread a message about his presidency and his presidential run, and therefore that account, according to the FEC, would be a commodity that would have to be monitored as if he was using it to run for office. So if he used that account like himself while he's a senator outside of a presidential election run, that could be hugely problematic for him. And on top of that, it could mean that the Democratic Party has control over that account now, because it was something that was but once again, you have to go through a certain process when you're running for office, and that includes giving up some of your autonomy over certain accounts. It's very similar, like with Ben Swan, for example. Ben Swan had to get rid of all of his social media. If you don't know, he was the investigative journalist that cracked Pizzagate wide open, started asking the questions that we should be asking. He never accused anyone of anything. He revealed the facts and say, why aren't we asking these questions, and how does this not at the very bare minimum warrant an investigation? And they took all of his accounts away because they were all connected to the network that he worked at the time, which I believe was CBS. It was a local news station for CBS, and he couldn't come back because he couldn't come back on those social media accounts because they didn't belong to him necessarily. He was only verified because he was working with that network. So if I got verified because I was on a network and then I left, then I would have to re-verify myself as an individual, not as someone that's working with that network. Because when you apply for verification, you have to go through a process that lets them know who you're working for, to let them know that you're a meaningful figure to a bigger brand. And so Bernie Sanders had to do that same thing. Obviously, as you know, as a senator, he has his senatorial account, but that other account was created during the presidency, and therefore he may not have as much autonomy over that as he would have over his senatorial accounts. Now, I want to premise before you all start going crazy, like, oh, that's him. First of all of his tweets, and this has been the case since the presidential election, because, well, I used to work with the campaign, and that was actually stressed during one of our trainings, just because we were talking about the debates and things like that. But if Bernie Sanders does not have a -B on that tweet, it is not him speaking. And if you've looked at that Twitter account, it's clear that it is not Bernie Sanders speaking in a lot of those tweets. Okay. So I just want to help people understand that. And another good litmus test on how much Bernie Sanders' personal views and policy advocation aligns with that Twitter account, what you want to do is, if you see a tweet from that Twitter account, just Bernie Sanders, not the Senator Sanders account, but the Bernie Sanders account, if you look at those tweets, go look at what Jane Sanders' Twitter is discussing. Go look at Nina Turner's Twitter. Go look at Levi Sanders, his son's Twitter, and see if they echo the same sentiments being expressed on that Bernie Sanders Twitter account. 99% of the time, it is not. In fact, neither Jane nor Levi has ever incited any Russia hysteria, and this is coming from a person who went to go listen to her speak at the People's Summit, where Bernie Sanders kind of brought up Russia. It seemed like a damn heat check. But he brought up Russia and was booed. But before that, Jane never brought it up. Jane was advocating for third parties. Jane was advocating for him to join Draft Bernie. Nina was advocating for him to join Draft Bernie. Roseanne DeMario, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but Roseanne DeMario was advocating for him to join Draft Bernie, and none of them were talking about Russia. None of them were talking about regime change in Syria. None of them were, clearly there's some strategy involved, and as much as I don't like the strategy, that doesn't change the fact that it may be necessary for him to secure his place without being totally bombarded with McCarthyism. Like, he was alive and actively a politician during McCarthyism, and I think people forget that sometimes. Bernie Sanders is old, okay? There's no way to sugarcoat it. The man is old, but he is in amazing shape. But he's still old. But the thing about being old is that Bernie Sanders knows one thing. Because he was alive during McCarthyism, and because he was politically active during McCarthyism, he knows probably better than anyone else in the run for president right now that if you at all counter the idea that Russia is our #1 enemy in an age where Russia is being portrayed as the #1 enemy, then you will never be president. They will make sure of it. First, we can go into the details about why that is, but That's what McCarthyism does. It takes leaders. It takes like people like the Black Panthers, like Martin Luther King at one point, like Malcolm X at one point, like Huey P. Newton at one point, well, black leaders, feminist leaders, any type of liberation movement. They turned them into, quote, if you opposed the Vietnam War, you were a communist sympathizer. So like, if you did that, you were never going to be president. And even those who, like, for example, JFK, who did oppose the communist war, I mean, he got killed. Excuse me, the anti-communism rhetoric. He got killed. If you look at the Muhammad Ali, who was not going to go fight someone else's war, he said we have our own issues right here. Muhammad Ali was painted as a communist sympathizer as well. I mean, it's clear that the value or the cost of him not doing what he has to do to protect his brand going into 2020 in his mind is much higher. The cost is much higher to him than the benefit of just being reactionary and emotional and quoting and parroting what we're saying, which we're saying the truth. Bernie Sanders seems to be well aware that we're saying the truth, which is why his Senator Sanders account looks nothing like his Bernie account. And the only time, if you've noticed, that they give him any type of mainstream coverage is when they're employing him or deploying him to try and coax progressives into the Russia rhetoric. But once again, if you've looked at what he says in those interviews on mainstream media, he still talks about all the things that we need and the things that we loved him for, which is Medicare for all, discussing environmental rights, discussing the rights of indigenous, the discussion of getting rid of the prison industrial complex. Look at what he's done for West Virginia people. Do you not remember him going to West Virginia? Because I distinctively remember that. And I even said, if you think Bernie Sanders is not playing for your team, you are mistaken. And if you think he's doing things for selfish agendas, you are mistaken. Why? Because the unfortunate truth of the matter is the likelihood that Bernie Sanders would win West Virginia in the general election is slim to none, because that is a dominantly Republican state that is not active on social media platforms. And therefore, it would be almost impossible for him to reach them in the way that he traditionally reached people in 2016. This is assuming that they're going to black him out of coverage in 2020 like they did in the 2015-2016 primaries. So he did that because it was necessary, because he wants to see this country progress. And he makes sacrifices and he makes hard calls sometimes. But at the same time, I never question where his heart is on an issue. I never question what he wants in the long run, because it's too late to be a sellout, people. I'm sorry. Like, nobody wakes up at 76 years old like, okay, shit, might as well go ahead and sell my soul now while I'm still allowed to enjoy it. He doesn't have to spend any time whatsoever doing what he's been doing right now. He doesn't. He does it because he legitimately believes in these issues. And I tell people, and you've heard me say it time and time again, it's hard for me to not like somebody who chained themselves to a black woman so she couldn't get arrested during civil rights. It's hard. As a Jewish American in Brooklyn, a Jewish American in Brooklyn who understood the plight of minorities and marginalized people, whereas some Jewish Americans at that time separated themselves from black people, pretending as if we were different, like our plight and our struggles were not similar. Remember, almost right after slavery, during Jim Crow, the Holocaust happened. And during the apartheid, the Holocaust was taking place, or had just taken place, excuse me. So our plights weren't all that different, and our struggles were extremely similar. And black Jewish people from Ethiopia, from Nigeria, etc., they had it even more difficult. But Bernie Sanders understood the plight of marginalized people and did not forget where he came from, being the child of immigrant Holocaust survivors. So that's important to remember. Now, moving on to Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard, because I want to start off with the bad and then we're going to get with the good, okay? Tulsi Gabbard has a problem. And a lot of people don't know about this problem because of where her newfound stardom came from. Her newfound stardom came from the fact that she left the Democratic committee to endorse Bernie Sanders, which was absolutely fantastic. However, earlier in her political career, Tulsi Gabbard was a centrist. And as a matter of fact, I would even venture to say that Tulsi Gabbard was a conservative. I know it's hard to believe, but the reason why is because you actually don't talk about these issues. We don't ever talk about them, or excuse me, she doesn't ever talk about them when she's talking to us. And she's very careful about that. And I want people to truly understand this. It's calculated. This is not an attack on Tulsi. This is a wake-up call because it's something that we're going to have to address going forward. I want to read to you some of what Tulsi Gabbard used to stand for. So a lot of you don't know Tulsi Gabbard's. Some people don't know, I should say. Tulsi Gabbard is Indian American. However, she is born in Hawaii. So she is a Hawaiian person. She can speak both. Last time I checked, she could speak both Hindi and I can't remember what the language is for Hawaiian, but we're just going to go with Hawaiian. And so that's where her culture is foundationalized in. Now, if you know anything about the history of Indian Americans, you know that they do have a culture of conservatism, and many countries do in the Middle East, as many Desi countries. And for those of you who don't know what Desi countries are, think about the area of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran. Let me think. Punjab, like that whole area, right? So that, and they're actually, believe it or not, considered Caucasian as well. Long story. But earlier in her career, Gabbard took after her father, who was actually an anti-LGBTQ person. Actually, he founded a quote-unquote educational nonprofit to stop promoting homosexuality, and he bought himself a show on a local radio station, and this was as a senator in Hawaii. She does come from a political background. So, and also earlier in her career, Gabbard took after her father. She opposed abortion and supported a constitutional amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman. After Honolulu magazine emailed her father to ask about his former ties to a conservative Hare Krishna splinter group for a 2004 profile, it was Gabbard who replied angrily, accusing the magazine of acting as a conduit for the Honolulu Weekly and other homosexual extremist supporters of Ed Case, her father's opponent. The same year, she used her platform as a state representative to testify against civil unions, which is same-sex marriage, calling the claim that they were different from same-sex marriage. Dishonest, cowardly, and extremely disrespectful to the people of Hawaii. This is from Gabbard. So, as a Democrat, we should be representing the views of the people, not a small number of homosexual extremists, she said at the time. Gabbard has since done a 180, citing her military service in the Middle East as an impetus for her conversion into social liberalism. Let me say something about that before I continue. Being in the military can do one of two things for you. If you are one without conviction, one who is easily malleable, that conforms to your environment, you can become ultra conservative. You can become very, very jaded. You believe that everything in life is about the military, about the army, about killing, about war. Or you become like myself. I'm not joking. I never used to be conservative. Actually, I would say that in high school, because I did debate, I was a libertarian, if you will. That would be probably the category that I was in. And even still, as a quote-unquote social conservative, I preferred abortion not being carried out. I preferred. I was a Christian at that time, like a hardcore religious Christian is what I mean. I'm still, in my eyes, a Christian, but only in the definition of spiritually Christ-like, as in I strive to help other people. I strive to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. You know, I walk with the prostitutes and the sinners. That's what I mean. But I was very similar to Tulsi Gabbard, not to that degree, because I was never against same-sex marriage. I just was not as strong of an advocate as I am for their right to have a civil union and share the same rights as anyone else. But my experiences in the military and listening to the ignorance that people use to defend themselves and defend nonsense, and the relationships I saw develop, and the stress of not being able to be yourself while you're in the military, and the racism that took place, not just against people within the military, but against those who don't look like us, that in countries that we were in, whether that be Korea, Iraq, Iran, Qatar. Like, the racism never stopped. In fact, one of the first words that we were taught were called Haji. That's what they called anybody from the Middle East, and that's kind of racist. So I do want to say that that's very realistic, and it happens to a lot of different people. So I want to continue though. As Gabbard, she said the contrast between our society and those in the Middle East made me realize that the reason those societies are so oppressive, is that they are essentially theocracies where the government and the government leaders wield power that both define and then enforce quote unquote morality. She wrote in a December 2011 post. So she had already began to grow as a person in 2011, despite us seeing the fruition of her growth in the public sphere in 2015 and 2016 after she endorsed Bernie Sanders. I began to realize that the positions I had held previously regarding the issues of choice and gay marriage were rooted in the same premise held by those in power in the oppressive Middle East regimes I saw. She affected a similar about face on abortion as well, receiving an endorsement from Emily's List in 2012 congressional election. Now, I'm not a fan of Emily's List, but back then, let's be very clear, Tulsi Gabbard was establishment. So I do want to make sure that that's understood, and that's something that's going to be used against her, and I'm explaining in a second why that can be used for her instead of against her. And by the way, she was only 23 after she shifted. That was around the same time I had my huge ideal shift, if you will, my huge ideology shift. She was 23 when she made that change. And so when she received that endorsement, she had gotten rid of her socially conservative views, because people with time, with experience, because we are all limited to our experiences, people evolve. If you get experience, you get time, you get education, you evolve. But suspicion of Gabbard does still linger sometimes, because her party, the LGBTQ caucus of the Democratic Party in her state, they still don't trust her. And in fact, unfortunately, they backed her Democratic opponent in 2016. And I think there's some like remaining issues because of how it may not even be against her. They just may not distrust her father. Luckily, the Supreme Court has been pretty clear on where they stand on the issue of gay marriage, and I don't see that being revoked anytime soon. That would be the first monumental ruling in Supreme Court history, in the United States history, that would be reversed. So when I say monumental, I mean a monumental move towards progress, inclusivity, and equity. That would be the equivalent of them saying that women are not allowed to vote, or that prohibition has been reenacted. That's how huge that would be. So I think those are things that we need to keep in mind. Now, she's also praised very heavily for her anti-interventionism, which is very good for the most part, but she has some issues. Once again, Gabbard's objections to the U.S., and this is according to another article, Gabbard's objections to the U.S. war spring not from a concern for those parts of the world the U.S. military bombs and invades, but exclusively from a concern about the Americans who fight in them. As she told in her 2012, her own military service changed her life completely. I don't agree with that sentiment. She's been very clear on why or how regime change and interventionism affects the innocent people involved in those countries. Now, here's unfortunately why that statement does have a leg to stand on. Tulsi Gabbard actually has some problematic policy avocations and some problematic endorsements in the Desi region of the Middle East. So, for example, she has been for regime change in Myanmar. She has, I'm going to find out his name so I can let you know, Ram Nath Kovind, which is the president of India, who is considered, prime minister of Israel, same thing, you all know what I mean, who is considered very dominantly conservative. Okay? He's not even well liked, to my knowledge, in India, just from what I can find. But it's problematic because that's, in my opinion, her background, who she is. Because in India, if you understand how this caste system works out there, Tulsi Gabbard would be kind of what would be a high-ranking family member because she's light-skinned. And she's Hindu or Hindi, excuse me. No, she practices Hindu, so therefore she is Hindu. Yeah, so you get the point. My point is that as in many countries that have been colonized, there is a huge dichotomy and a huge rights discrepancy from those who are darker and those who are lighter, and those who are lighter or white-skinned, like in many societies, especially capitalistic ones, she has some biases that come from that. So it's important to understand that even Tulsi will have her issues going forward if she decides to run in 2020 as much as Bernie Sanders does. Now, here's where I actually believe Tulsi has somewhat of an advantage. So even though she hasn't been on the right side of history her entire life or even her entire professional career, she is on the right side of history right now for the most part. Okay, so if we want to talk about the fact that she jumped ship from the DNC and lost her funding because of that, that is something that's huge and will be discussed heavily going into why we should believe, 2020, and discussing why we believe that Bernie Sanders is less establishment or Tulsi Gabbard is less establishment, or who is more beholden to the establishment. Tulsi Gabbard has also believed that the Syrian war was not instigated by Assad, nor is it being perpetuated by Assad, and she is against regime change in Syria, as many of us are. Any progressive should be against regime change in Syria because we are clearly the ones that instigated that, who have funded ISIS. And speaking of which, only Tulsi Gabbard has introduced legislation to stop the funding of indirect or direct funding of terrorists. In fact, she passed legislation called Stop Arming Terrorists Act. It was pretty simple. Stop arming terrorism. Stop funding terrorism. And that was her only premise. And it failed miserably because neoliberals and the establishment don't want that to happen. They get funded by the war profiteers in the military industrial complex, so they didn't want that to happen. But I'm just saying, whenever that's discussed going forward, guess who gets to say that she introduced legislation to stop the profiteering of war and to stop funding terrorism? And guess who's going to be questioned whenever we ask, well, why did you vote against it? Okay, so she also is introducing election reform legislation to have backup. I don't want any voting machines whatsoever, but in my opinion, I actually think that this might be genius. Now, here's why. Her legislation proposes that even though we keep voting machines, as in like electronic voting machines, digital voting machines in play, that we back them up 100% holistically with paper ballots. So when you put your electronic voting machine in to make it so that we can count faster, because that's why they do that, you also back your numbers up on paper ballots. And so if there's any in hand counted paper ballots, so if there are discrepancies, we'll know. And in my opinion, we need that, because we need to know who is cheating and who is being cheated for, because that lets us know if you're on the side of the establishment or not, and if the establishment wants you to win versus a progressive. So that's why it's super important, in my opinion, to at least allow voting machines to stay in play, because before we take them out, I want to know who is on the side of the establishment, who is trying, who is the pretender in the situation, right? Because if the voting machines are being rigged against you, then you are likely the progressive. If in the primary, I mean, in the general election, if the voting machines are being rigged in general, you want to know who's doing the rigging so that we can hold them directly accountable. And so I'm actually for that. Tulsi Gabbard also made, like I said, because she made that huge leap of faith into the Bernie Sanders campaign, she lost a lot of funding as a result. And because of that, it's huge to me that she's still staying progressive despite losing her funding, and potentially because she did have to run in a Democratic primary election. She could have lost that, because that's funding that she has been counted on for, money that she has accounted for in the past while running for office. So, all those are things that I think would be huge for Tulsi Gabbard. Also, the fact that she is incredibly young. I think she'll be maybe 36, 37 if she decided to run in 2020. And just from inside sources with her campaign and in her circle, it's looking like she's not joking. She's probably going to run. That's why she's been so active. That's why she's been so vocal. That's why she's been such a proponent of election reform, because many of us, she's listening to progressives, and many of us are very well aware that without election reform, that these elections are a farce as they currently stand. And that's something that would encourage progressives to vote for her over Bernie Sanders, who has not talked about election reform in a substantive way, at least not as substantive as we would like. So the good thing about both of them running, well, if Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Kirsten Gillibrand all decide to run along with Elizabeth Warren, I'm not sure what would happen. But with those three, at least Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, they could sweep the black vote significantly. Okay, and that's reality. And a lot of people say, well, they will split the vote and then that's fine. No, it's not really fine. Here's why. Because you get to choose who you give your delegates to when it's all said and done. Very similar to how Martin O'Malley gave his delegates, the few that he had, to Hillary Clinton. Of course, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker could give their respective delegates to each other depending on who lasts the longest, or they can give it to the establishment candidate who is left. Now with Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, the same logic applies. Tulsi Gabbard would garner a lot of support from women and women of color. She would gather massive support in inner cities if she deals with her regime, her pro-regime change rhetoric in India and Myanmar and that general region. So that could be used to her advantage. If Bernie Sanders concedes to Tulsi Gabbard, that could be used. So the first part could be used to his advantage. The thing that could be used to her advantage is if Tulsi Gabbard concedes, or if Bernie Sanders concedes, he would be then able to give his conservative votes, because he gets a lot of conservative votes that I think Tulsi Gabbard would also potentially win. But he would be able to give those to Tulsi Gabbard when it's all said and done. So that's a great thing for both of them. Now, I'm going to be very honest about one last thing. Tulsi Gabbard is absolutely drop dead gorgeous. Like, let's be honest, people. And when it comes to visual appeal, that has been a huge indicator of who will win an election over the other. You know, it's a combination of both star power and visual appeal. Tulsi Gabbard's speaking ability, she speaks very well. She's extremely articulate, but she's not very exciting like Bernie Sanders is. He's full of energy, full of life when he's speaking. However, Tulsi Gabbard is not. But the advantage that she has is that she is very easy to look at, and that's just a fact. And if we look at JFK, Barack Obama, and how both of them very dominantly won their elections, very dominantly won their Democratic primaries. It's always said that, what did they say about the Nixon? Was it Richard Nixon versus JFK? And they said, was it Nixon versus JFK? I want to say it was Nixon versus JFK. They said whoever listened to the radio said that Nixon won the debate, and whoever listened to whoever watched the debates on television or in person said that JFK won the debate. So just so you know, that's like a huge indicator of somebody who could potentially win an election. That's why I mean, Marco Rubio is a pretty face that they put out in front for the Democratic Party. He doesn't, or excuse me, for the Republican Party. He doesn't do anything, but he has a very beautiful family, and he has like a youthful appeal. Cory Booker is very similar in that regard. They try to use his youth to their advantage in the Democratic Party as well. So, and they do that not by accident. They do that on purpose. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I would love to know what your thoughts and opinions are about this particular election, or potential election race. Don't take this as me insulting either of them, me thinking less of either of them. If anything, take this as the reality that we aren't purists as progressives. That's how I take it. We aren't purists. Nor do I expect you to be a quote-unquote purist. I think about the greater good, and I think about the best candidates and the people with the best intentions. If anything, this shows us that no candidate, no matter who that person is going to be, is perfect. If I ran for office, or when I do run for office, I have a criminal record. I've gotten in a fight with 6 cops, and that's going to come up. Actually, no, because it disappeared from the records. Don't ask why, don't ask how. But essentially, I was jumped by 6 police officers, and that's something that could potentially come up if someone did their research. Okay, and I'm not ashamed of that because it made me who I am. Just like a combination of Tulsi's conservative background and then what she learned from that, carrying it into her progressive background, makes her experiences so much more unique and valuable because she can speak from both perspectives. Just like with Bernie Sanders has his civil rights background, and he also has mistakes that he has made in the past that he can learn from in policy advocacy, and take that forward with him into the White House. But none of us are perfect, okay? And that's the moral of that story. And we need to make the best decision. But making the decision based off of the person's intent in combination with the policies they advocate for is perfectly fine. And that's not purity tests and purism and all that good stuff that the neoliberals like to launch at us. That's not what that is. That's just, you know when someone is staring you in your fucking face and lying, and you know when someone may be very genuine, good-intentioned, or well-intentioned, and they just make a misstep every now and then. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for tuning in. I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast. I did make it a little bit longer to make up for the fact that I haven't posted as much in the last couple of days as I would have liked. So I hope that you enjoyed this. As always, donate to Patreon to help out the show. Go check out the YouTube channel as well. The website is coming sooner rather than later. And always remember, ladies and gentlemen, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.